Your lecturer is Dr. Kenneth R. Bartlett, a highly popular member of the Great Courses faculty. Dr. Bartlett is Professor of History and Renaissance Studies at the University of Toronto. He is the winner of several major teaching awards. These include the prestigious 3M Teaching Fellowship from the Canadian Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Education, as well as the inaugural President's Teaching Award from the University of Toronto.
Hello, my name is Ken Bartlett, and I'm a professor of history at the University of Toronto, and I'm going to talk about the development of European civilization. Europe is more than a place, it's an idea, it's a memory. Europe has developed so many of the institutions and so many of the ideas that have animated and driven so much of the world that we have to look at Europe from its own perspective. We have to see how these ideas developed. We have to see the site-specific and circumstance-specific context in which these isms, ideas, thoughts, institutions, and vehicles for their expression came about. And when we talk about Europe, we're talking about then more than a place. We're not talking about a continent, even a large continent that stretches from Asia to the Atlantic, from the North Sea down to the Mediterranean. We're talking about a set of memories that's part of the Western DNA. Moreover, we see that the political, social, economic, cultural history of Europeans has affected almost every aspect of the world's civilization. And it's done so through a variety of means. The obvious and most immediate, especially for those of us living in North America, are the emigrations of the 19th and 20th centuries in particular, but the contact that began at the end of the 15th. It was through contact, conversion, and immigration that so many of the ideas and institutions of Europe reached around the world. And this contact and this immigration brought ideas and memories that then took root in a different soil and allowed the opportunity of other places to benefit from European experience, in some instances to reject them completely, in others to develop and to mature them. Moreover, Europe was a place that created and wrote and spread and extended ideas. Europe is a continent of ideas. Europeans are always discussing principles and how those principles should best be made manifest. As a result, the books that have animated Western civilization have spread, and some of the ideas in those books have taken root very, very deeply. When we think of communist China, for example, we must remember that communism is a European invention and is now the dynamic force that helped create the modern Chinese state. When we think of liberalism and democracy, we think of those principles that have animated so much of the free world. Consequently, Europe is a dynamic. It's a dynamic because it is driven by an energy of its own creation and also by an energy that can be applied at different times and different places. Because it was debate, it was argument over these fundamental principles that drove so many of the international relations and drove so many of those peoples around the world to either embrace or to reject things that happened in Europe. So European civilization put down deep roots, and the institutions where these flourished still live with us today and still to some extent define what it is to be a citizen of the planet Earth. So when we talk about institutions like parliamentary or representative democracy, we're talking about a set of principles that developed on the European continent in its earliest forms in the polis of ancient Greece, but also that then developed through the British parliamentary system and then through the 19th century manifestations of liberal elements of representational government to the creation of the concepts that really drive us in any free society. The rule of law, an independent judiciary, and those concepts that put the law above everybody, including the ruler of the state. Only in a free society can there be a law that pertains to everyone, regardless of power, wealth, or influence. And that, again, is one of the great gifts of Europe to the world. Social legislation, the sorts of ideas that are particularly European, and the instruments and the vehicles that were developed in order to put them in place and to give them a structure are particularly European. The idea then that the community owes much to the individual and that the individual owes much to the community is something that is profound and based upon the experience of Europe over a number of centuries. We will see in subsequent lectures how these ideas took deep root beginning almost in those earliest years of European civilization. We'll see, in fact, how after the collapse of Rome, the idea of communal agriculture through feudalism, the idea of a manorial economy created a sense of community in which there were mutual responsibilities for the economy and society to work. There was a set of responsibilities that were both enshrined in law and then practiced in customs. This, in fact, is very much still part of the European imagination. The idea of this mutual responsibility and this mutual dynamic between the individual and the larger group, the collective, the state, the community, however you want to define them. And so many of the ideologies then that we'll be discussing later in this course really try and deal with this issue. What are the restrictions on the concept of individual human rights that allow the community to function? And then what are the necessary restrictions on the community to allow individual freedom to operate? These are the sorts of dynamics and challenges and debates that still exist, that still animate European political discussion, and as a consequence, help animate ours as well. Because these are not site-specific, depending on a continent or a set of nations in one place. They're ideas about the human condition. And what I hope we're seeing is, in fact, a group of ideas in the human condition that will then allow us to see how these concepts and isms can then move to another place. Similarly, when we talk about ideas of, let's say, the establishment of regular taxation, the idea that the individual owes something to the community through the alienation of personal wealth, we see another instrument that developed in Europe, taxation that is to be governed not at the whim of the prince, not something that would simply be channeled in order to enrich the ruler and to allow him or her to exercise more arbitrary authority, but instead a set of ideas that allow the community to operate using money as a lubricant for the creation of a new kind of social machine that ensures that all citizens enjoy some measure of prosperity and some measure of comfort within the community in which they live. So these ideas then are dynamic. They are still with us. They still, in fact, operate. And many of the states of Europe also provide examples of a kind of set of experiments. If we think of Europe as a number of petri dishes in a laboratory, each one experimenting with a new organic form of organization, political, social, economic, and how these petri dishes in fact determine different kinds of solutions, we'll see that the European experiment is in no way singular. We can't generalize about Europe. We can't say that Europe is a singular place because Europe is a multifarious place. It is a place where so many experiments were happening simultaneously, producing so many different results and producing so many different kinds of solutions to complex problems that we really recognize that Europe, in fact, is to some extent the genetic testing of Western civilization. So, for example, if we think of the model of political organization, we can see that there are republics as long as there have been monarchies. That in fact republics had the same kind of rich and long-lasting tradition that we associate with monarchical Europe. The Republic of Venice lasted 1100 years. The papacy, the most successful institution in the Western world, has lasted even longer, and the head of state, the Pope, is elected, and so it forms a kind of theocratic republic. And even monarchies can be generalized, not only over time, but even in the nature of the institution. When we think, for example, of the British monarchy as a hierarchical structure in which the crown embodies the concept of the state and the embodiment of law, then in fact we can see that it is an operating democracy and that so many of the democratic liberal principles that gave rise to European civilization and had been exported elsewhere came about in the context of a monarchy. And when we think of the Scandinavian countries, in which the monarchies form the general context of some of the most experimental social legislation and social democracies on earth, then we see too that you cannot assume that monarchies are repressive and that kings rule above the law, because the evidence is that they don't. So Europe then has always been and will continue to be a continent of isms. A continent of ideas in which the ideas drive society, and subsequently those changes in society then produce in themselves new isms to address new problems and different kinds of institutions. In fact, what we can see is that the modern political discourse in Europe represents so many of the professions of secular belief that really constitute modern political discourse and provided us with the vocabulary of that discourse. Just think of the isms that Europe has produced: absolutism, nationalism, capitalism, socialism, liberalism, conservatism, even totalitarianism. These ideas were created in order to address particular problems, but nevertheless, in that experimental form, they created ideas so powerful and so flexible that they could be applied in other contexts to solve the problems of others at different times in different places. So, to go back to my image, Europe is a laboratory for a set of principles that we're going to be seeing working out over time. Some of these ideas are and should be challenged. Many should, in fact, be rejected. But others, in fact, we have embraced and we have institutionalized, and so they still provide some of the engines of our modern world. And in fact, if we look at some of these elements, if we look at those that, in fact, have been driven to address particular problems, we in fact can see how these things in fact can operate and can work, not only to look at the sorts of situations that gave rise to them, but in some instances actually came about ex post facto, after the experience, in order to try and justify and explain those things that had happened. The most obvious in this example is the Industrial Revolution, about which we will speak at great length in a later lecture. The Industrial Revolution is a model of an unintended consequence, the application of technology and population rise in transportation and raw materials to the creation of really what amounts to a completely different society based on different principles. There is no precedence for this transformation, no precedence whatsoever for this economic and social and political transformation in so short a time. Consequently, the problems generated by new classes that didn't exist before, the industrial working class, new demographics, people moving by the millions from one part of a nation to another, from one nation to another, different kinds of occupations, the movement from the countryside to the city, the upheaval that resulted from these, a creation of large metropolitan spaces that had completely uncontrolled growth, and the economic turmoil that followed. And in fact, we'll see that from this turmoil, from this explosion of new circumstances, there arose something completely different. There arose a new set of ideas that allowed Europeans to interpret their own world. From it arose a new social class, again, at least one that was newly animated with new components, and that was the middle class. And this middle class, armed with new ideas to confront these new problems, helped create the dynamic of 19th century European culture. Also, the understanding of this, the understanding of European civilization, must also be seen in the response against which many of these circumstances found themselves in conflict. So when these new ideas arose in the context of the Industrial Revolution, what in fact they faced was in fact a set of social givens, a set of social structures and instruments still dominated by traditional elites, who not only didn't understand what was happening, but saw it as a challenge to their traditional authority. So what we see then again is the concept of the dynamic, something that must really be active in order to create some kind of new control, some kind of new institution, new structure that will face and be able to address the kinds of problems that have been developing. So flexibility enters the European imagination, and it enters our own, because of the fact that no one can anticipate the problems that any nation will face and any circumstance that will be available. The wide examples of so many European states over so long a time have provided a number of examples of both success and failure. We have to remember that this course covers more or less 6 centuries, covers a period that is not only the development of a civilization that was uniquely European, but based upon longer memories that go back into antiquity and almost part of the anthropological structure of the continent. Similarly, when we think of the change over that period of time, we can see it to be absolutely dramatic, that the transformation was so profound, it's very difficult, in fact, to imagine that there was one single set of circumstances or event, or one single people, or one single imagination actually giving shape to this remarkable change over such a long period of time. But nevertheless, these things happened. And it's our responsibility in this course to see why they happened and to see how and to see what was significant about them. The study of history really has very little value unless you can understand the significance, the driving force that actually gives definition to change. And we're going to look at Europe as, in fact, a continent of change. The change then happened in its own context. We have to see Europe from its own point of view. We've got to, in fact, ensure that our perspective was that of Europeans rather than seeing it from the lens from without. We in North America tend to look at the world from the perspective and through the prism of our experience in the New World, whereas in Europe, because memories are so long and institutions have such deep roots, they tend to be much more drawn to their own experience and their own point of view. And that is what we, to some extent, must adopt. We have to see Europe from its own perspective and not make value judgments. We can't make judgments about the nature of European society because, although we owe much to it, it is not ours. We have to understand why Europe is Europe and why it differs from the rest of the world, despite the many points of contact. For example, Europe has been called the violent continent, and with very good reasons. Europeans have often, in fact, expressed many of the tensions and difficulties that they have experienced through war. War becomes then an instrument of policy. It becomes an extension of diplomacy by other means. It becomes all of the other expressions that try to justify violence. However, the wars became ever more unspeakable. We will talk about the almost unimaginable horror of the 30 Years' War that introduced the concept of total war. We'll talk about the extent of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars that spread across an entire continent and drew in almost every significant nation on one side or another, and occasionally on both. Civil war being another aspect of European experience. And then we will look at the macabre circumstance of the First World War. A bloodletting, a savage moment that's very, very difficult for us to understand in the loss of life and the horror of the trenches. And then, of course, the Second World War, that moment when Europe seemed to want to destroy itself and turned against its own citizens in a way that it's very, very difficult for us to imagine. War then and violence constitute indeed part of the European experience. It is indeed the violent continent. And much of the institutional structure that we're going to talk about came about from the needs of society, the needs of rulers, the needs of government to draw in every aspect of wealth and commitment on the part of citizens in order to fight war. It has been suggested, especially in the past, that many of the institutions of European states grew to perfection as a way of mobilizing for war. There's some truth to that, but at the same time, it also is a manifestation of the need in order to mobilize citizens to achieve particular goals. Goals are sometimes accomplished by war, but they're accomplished by other means as well. The French Revolution did produce war, a terrible series of wars that spread through the Napoleonic Wars for the next 25 years. But nevertheless, at the same time, it also produced something quite different, a set of ideas that were actually more powerful than any armies, that grand mobilization of French citizens that could ever be imagined. Ideas are more powerful than arms, and Europe has shown that even when wars are over, ideas are sustained, and the ideas remain there to be challenged. The central and dynamic role of the state and the dynamic role of the ideas that animate the state, then, must be acknowledged. We have to see in Europe that ideas are very much part of daily life. My students ask why when they turn on the French national television network at prime time, there are no car chases, there are no gunfights, there are talking heads. There is no North American equivalent in prime time of apostrophe or those programs in which individuals argue about principles, often referring to books that they assume that everyone in the audience has read. Ideas are still part of the European vocabulary inasmuch as they're part of the European intellectual diet. You cannot separate the European mind from the ideas that formed them over so many centuries. And this, in some ways, is why we are different from them. We see the world from a different set of circumstances and perspectives. And so we're going to continue that. discussion in this course to see, in fact, how these ideas and institutions created a European continent that reached very, very different sorts of conclusions about politics and society and the economy from the North American nations in which we live. As a result, this course is not really a course in political history. It's not a survey. It's not what happened when. It's not a description of a series of causalities that give rise to the present. It's not a Whig interpretation of the world, at the end of which we will stand and sing, "We're here because we're here." It rather is something quite different. It will be a close association of intellectual, social, and economic ideas into a political context. The other thing that is necessary in any discussion of a course of European civilization, even in 48 episodes, is that we have to make hard decisions. We can't talk about an entire continent. We can't talk about each individual nation state. We can't talk about each individual nation. We can't give equal time to all linguistic and cultural groups. We, in fact, cannot give equal time to all significant events. What we need to do is to look at Europe as it develops as a whole, to provide examples and moments that will elucidate, illuminate, and define the principles that we're really talking about. At the end of this course, I want you to understand Europe and to know what the European mind is thinking and how it got there, so that when you set foot on the continent or when you read a book written by a European or about Europe, you will know where it's coming from. The result is then that we will come at the end of this course with a mosaic. The mosaic will be created of a number of tesserae, and each one of those examples will add another piece to that puzzle that will allow the European civilization to become visible. Each piece will be important, but it will not be only dependent upon itself. It will be representative. It will be broadly representative of the experience of many peoples at many times. So we'll have to make decisions. For example, I am not going to talk about religion as a belief system, but rather as an ideological construct. The points of theology, regardless how important they were in the political and social development of certain European states, are to some extent to be left in favor of what those ideas ultimately produced in terms of the social, political, and economic structure. When we see Henry VIII nationalizing the English Church, when we see the transformation of Lutheranism as an instrument for the movement of secular jurisdiction from the church to lay magistrates, we see in fact a social and political and economic revolution as well as a theological one. Also, we have to privilege certain areas over others. Obviously, the major states of the continent will be given a certain amount of time. You can't discuss Europe without talking about France, what would become Germany, England, the Italian states, and after 1861 or 1870, the Italian state. You can't talk about Europe without talking about the expansion of the continent through the voyages of discovery, which means a discussion of Spain and Portugal. But nevertheless, these individual states will arise in the context only of the example for which they're going to be used. So, for example, I will talk about Russia, that huge landmass that strides across Europe and Asia, mostly in the context of the revolution that changed the course of 20th century history. We'll talk about Russia in terms of the revolution and its causes. We'll talk about the 19th century circumstances, to be sure, but ultimately that will be the role that Russia will play. Some other states, for example, Spain, will play a much larger role at the beginning of the course. We'll talk about Spain and the development of the Iberian Peninsula, the creation of the Spanish kingdom, as a consequence of not only dynastic union and the alternative source of power and center of gravity of the continent by the end of the 15th century, but also in terms of the voyages of discovery that helped finance and drive that new Spanish state and the significance of it. So the complexity of the European state system will have to be discussed in general chronological terms. We have to see how things developed over time. History, as the study of change over time, presupposes that change will happen. And what my role will be is to explain why that change happened, and to some extent, what it meant. And there are other very difficult things to discuss. For example, the Holy Roman Empire. What are we talking about when at different times in the course we'll talk about the Holy Roman Empire, the Austrian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg dominions? all of them refer more or less to the same geographical area in Central and Eastern Europe. But nevertheless, I will use the term most appropriate at the time, and the maps will help illustrate exactly what part of Europe we're talking about when. And although I'm going to have to focus, and with some sad resignation, on the dynamics of the larger states of Europe, I also want to recognize that many contributions were made by smaller states, and if only we in fact could have more time in which to look at them and their contributions in a broader context. So, for example, a powerful and rich and important nation like Hungary, I will look at in terms of the inability of the Hungarian king to stop the Turkish advance and the slaughter of the Hungarian nobility and monarch at Mohacs, but at the same time look at it in terms of the states between the wars. In between, Hungary will fall into the Habsburg dominions and to the other circumstances that will be looked at in a broader context. There will be other states where the same will happen. And I apologize in advance for not being able to look at each one of your favorite European monarchies, republics, or states, the places from which your families perhaps originated, because simply there is not enough time and there's not enough space. Also, chronologically, I end the course in 1939, which may seem to some extent a little bit curious, but there is a very good reason for ending in 1939, and it refers to what I said about how European society must be defined in its own terms. If we want to look at Europe as a European construction, as driven by ideas that developed in Europe and that played elsewhere, we in fact will have to end in 1939 because the coming of the Second World War meant that Europe was no longer an independent entity in so many ways. For example, with the entry of the United States in the Second World War, and especially with the reconstruction of Europe afterwards, it's impossible to discuss Europe without talking about the United States. And that, again, shifts the focus from what it is I want to achieve. Also, the fundamental division of the continent during the Cold War between the allies and supporters of the Soviet Union and general supporters of international communism and supporters of NATO and the West and supporters of parliamentary democracy and freedom, this difficult coexistence, this tension, really created a set of principles that were not really altogether made in Europe. The ideologies behind them were, but the forces that defined them and drove them were not. The other element that we haven't got time to discuss that is so important, and in fact to some extent is one of the dynamics that is shaping our world, is the second industrial revolution of technology. With the coming especially of the computer age and the technological revolution after the Second World War, we're creating a completely different kind of society, one in which globalization and one in which the differences amongst people and the differences amongst economies, societies, and states all become blurred as we see them through the singular machine based upon technology and technological innovation. That too is something that, although they had deep roots in Europe, these ideas could in fact not be fully explained, and hence I stop in 1939. And then finally, I want to end on a moment of hope, and that is the significance of the European Union. To some extent, the idea of the unity of Europe is something that will be redolent through the entire course. Everything that I say will have memories of the concept of the unity of the continent, going back to the idea of the Roman Empire, to a universal Roman confession, to the Holy Roman Empire, Napoleon's dreams of conquest, to put the continent together under a single ruler with a single legal system and a single set of principles of freedom as he determined. Similarly, the conferences of Westphalia and Versailles were predisposed to work from an idea that Europe is a collective and that the problems of Europe had to be solved not bilaterally or through imposition, but rather through negotiation, discussion, and through a collective conclusion. The modern manifestation of this dream of unity in Europe, then, is in fact the concept of the European Union. This is in itself a remarkable moment. What began as a series of minor economic advantages with the Treaty of Rome in 1957 has in fact become the creation of a new principle, of perhaps the greatest federated state that existed since perhaps Charlemagne or the Roman Empire, but one that isn't based upon the power of a single emperor or single king, but based rather upon the idea of a shared culture and shared values and shared experience. The European Union then, although outside the discussion of this course, to some extent is a leitmotif that will run through all of it. That to some extent the history we're talking about between the collapse of the Roman Empire and the coming of the Second World War is really creating the preconditions, is building the foundations and setting the piers into the ground on which the European Union can be built. The creation of a new civilization and a new powerful continent in which the differences will be recognized, the differences will be celebrated, but at the same time, the recognition that the totality of Europe is greater than the sum of its parts. And if this succeeds, Europe will have succeeded. And if this succeeds, there will be another model coming from that violent continent, a model of reconciliation and a model of unity that can perhaps provide an example for the rest of the world to live in peace and harmony, and ideally in collective values generally shared.